Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfree, and what you're about to listen to is an old episode of a podcast I used to host called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. This particular episode was originally recorded on April 18th, 2014, and well, there's some episodes of this show I'm very, very proud of. There's some that, for a variety of reasons, I wish I'm not going to go back and redo any of these, unless there's some giant outcry, I suppose. But there's some that I kind of wish I'd done differently. And this episode, this is not to say don't listen to the show, or even to try and unduly lower your expectations. This is just to say, and I go over this a little bit at the start of the episode, I was not really prepared to be a meaningful contributor to the discussion in this particular episode, the way that I have in others. This episode talks about the villains of The Flash, his rogues gallery, the DC character. And I consequently wound up just kind of interviewing almost my guest, Pat Mullin. And it's one of those that, you chalk it up to a learning experience and you move forward. But I do kind of wish this one had gone better. The Flash is one of those characters that a lot of people really like. I'm a bit more on the ambivalent side of things, to be candid. But it's just unfortunate that the way it played out, I don't think I was able to quite have the kind of conversation and discussion that I would have liked to have had when discussing the Flash's Rogues Gallery. And again, this aired in 2014, so elements of the Flash television show not really going to be discussed a whole lot here. To say nothing of the potential upcoming Flash movie, assuming that ever gets made. So it's really a lot more limited to the comics and some of the more direct adaptations of them, stuff like the DC animated movies over at Warner Brothers. So that it's a little bit more limited in scope, and I was not as prepared as I should have been. That's all my bad. And I want to be upfront about that before you get into the episode proper. Before we get into the episode proper as well, if you could please like, comment, subscribe, share, tell a friend. All of that helps support the podcast. Also supporting the podcast are our sponsors, believe it or not. First up, let's talk about Amazon Music. If you like listening to streaming music on the internet, and who doesn't, the Amazon Music Unlimited service is pretty much the best. It's got a library of over 70 million songs, and with the unlimited setup, you can listen to them all ad-free. If that sounds like something you're interested in, go to getamazonmusic.com/W2Mnetwork. There will be a link to that as well in the description below if you'd rather just click on that. You'll get 30 days for free. After that, figure out if you wish to keep it or not. That's entirely up to you. But you'll have had the benefits of experiencing it for 30 days. And you'll just, again, reap the benefits thereof for free premium streaming music. There's no real downside. All right, also supporting the podcast is Grammarly. For you listeners of the W2M network, Grammarly is offering a free download of the Grammarly software. Grammarly's AI-powered products help people communicate more effectively. Grammarly helps you write mistake-free on Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and nearly anywhere else you write on the web. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes, while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. To download Grammarly today, go to getgrammarly.com/W2Mnetwork. Again, that's getgrammarly.com/W2Mnetwork to download Grammarly for free. There is a link in the description for that as well. All right, with that out of the way, let me toss it back to myself and Pat Mullin, circa 2014, talking about The Flash. Enjoy the show, ladies and gentlemen.
When the devil is too busy and death a bit too much, they call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentlemen, I'm misfortune. To the ladies, I'm surprise. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the devil in your shoe, I'm the key beneath your bed, I'm the bump on every head, I'm the heel on which you slip, I'm the pin in every head, I'm the thorn in your side, makes you wriggle and writhe. And it's so easy when you're evil. This is the life you see, the devil tips his hat to me. I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank everyone for clicking on the button, be it live, download after the fact, many years from now, or to any anthropologists, archaeologists, or alien life forms that have discovered this. Greetings, welcome, thank you very much, I appreciate it. I am your host tonight here on Everyone Loves a Bad Guy, the authority on evil, Mr. Robert Winfree. Quick story before we really kind of jump into this one. I actually wasn't planning on having a show tonight. I had some stuff that I was going to do. Long story short, I just kind of felt, take a week off. It happens from time to time. Well, it turns out I was learning my car to someone, and I just forgot that I was doing that, so I didn't have anything else to do. And my guest here tonight was gracious enough to jump in kind of on short notice and tackle the subject I was going to bring up next week. So I'm not as prepared as I normally am, so I'm apologizing for that because this is kind of a last-minute thing. And I'm going to be leaning on him a bit heavier than usual, even though he carries pretty much the Rattleton Broadcasting Network. Pat Mullin is here to join us again. How you doing, Pat?
Oh, I'm fantastic, Robert. Always a pleasure to be here.
It's always nice to have you. Now, for those of you who, I'm assuming that because everyone clicked on the link, we're talking about the villains of The Flash. Now, I've been kind of slogging my way through various comic book characters and their villains for the last, I'm going on a couple of months now, so it's been fun. And I was definitely planning on The Flash next week when I decided I wasn't doing one this week, but again, here we are, kind of last minute, and I felt like covering The Flash because, and here's one of the things about the character in general, from my perspective. He's a character that if you read comics and are into, kind of the, not even necessarily the culture, but if you're big into the graphic novels, the comics, and even to a somewhat lesser extent, the well-done Warner Brothers animated films or his appearances in the Justice League comics, when you're into him, when you're in that kind of realm, to one degree or another, you love The Flash. The Flash is awesome. All the iterations have been, generally speaking, well-written. They're solid characters. And everyone loves The Flash if you're within that sphere. If you're not, he's kind of a third fiddle. No one really knows what's up with the character. They tend to he's the guy who goes really fast. It's just kind of what the perception most people have of the character. And it's a shame because it's not necessarily the most accurate of statements of not just the character but the mythology in general. And so that's one of the reasons I'm glad you were able to do this one with me, Pat, because I know you're more into the realm of comics. You're more into that sphere than I am at this point in time. And as one of those people, you, from what I gather, have a deep love of the character. I mean, and it's a real shame that he's not been given proper treatment to reach a wider audience, because as a character, the Flash itself has, pardon the pun here, it has the legs to gain some serious traction.
Without a doubt, and hopefully the new attempt at the character in a mainstream medium with a full series based around him on the CW to kind of carry the load with the new Arrow series that's been such a hit can kind of do him some justice, which his original TV show that aired in 1990 did not, due to being shifted around in constant different time slots due to coverage of this little thing called the Gulf War. So, and it was a good, fun show, and definitely good for the time, but it never really got the chance to bring that character to life the way it could have. So hopefully this new show will attempt to do it, and hopefully our show tonight can kind of give people a little bit of perspective.
Well, wasn't there a horrible movie at some point?
Involving the Flash? No.
Huh. I have some vague memories of seeing something along those lines, but my memory can be faulty at times with irrelevant information.
There were some videotape releases of episodes of the show that were kind of chopped and edited together. That may be kind of what you're thinking toward.
Yeah, that's probably it. It's just one of those things. Again, vague memories from my childhood, so that's probably it. All right. Now, since you're my resident expert, not necessarily the definitive expert, my resident expert at the time, who is the Flash's kind of marquee villain? Every great hero has like the one guy who is their opposite number. Be it Joker, Doctor Doom, Sinestro, Loki, whoever it is. Everybody's got kind of their one opposite number. So who's that for the Flash?
Well, I'm glad you used the word opposite, because the Flash may be more so than any other hero, and regardless of what iteration we're talking about, be it Barry Allen, who is usually referred to as the Flash, his successor Wally West, his successor Bart Allen, the arch villain among arch villains for him is Professor Zoom, who's often referred to as the Reverse Flash. And he really makes a statement, because if you look at his costume is the inverted version of the Flash's costume, where the Flash's costume is one of the more famous in comics. It's a very bright red outlook with the yellow lightning bolts and boots. Well, where the Flash's costume is the bright red, Zoom's costume is a bright yellow. The yellow lightning bolts have been replaced by red ones, and the white moon around the lightning bolt is replaced by a black one on Zoom's costume. So in the very literal visual sense, he is the opposite and antithesis of the Flash.
Actually, I've looked up some images for him, and yeah, that's visually speaking, you're absolutely right. So give me kind of a little background on him. What's up with Professor Zoom?
Probably one of the more detailed yet confusing origins in some respects in comics. Professor Zoom is actually from the future. His name is Eobard Thawne, and basically he makes his first actual appearance, if you're going by true timeline stream, in the 90s series of The Flash, in which Wally West was the titular character. And what it was is Thawne was he was living in the 25th century, and he was such a super fan of Barry Allen, the Flash, that he wanted to do anything he could to meet him. So what he does was he recreates the accident that gave Barry his super speed, where he gets doused with an electrochemical bath. Unfortunately for him, he gets horribly disfigured and burned by it and needs multiple surgeries to fix himself. And what he does in this time to furthermore make himself like the Flash is he alters his physical appearance with these surgeries to make himself look like Barry Allen. And, because of all these things that have happened, he uses a device called the Cosmic Treadmill, which is a time travel device within the Flash comics, to try to go ahead and meet Barry. What happens is he arrives years after Barry sacrifices himself to save the universe in Crisis on Infinite Earths. And along with all these accidents that he's gone through and now the trauma of arriving after his death, he goes one step further and finds out when looking through the Central City Flash Museum that his destiny is to become the Reverse Flash, die at the hands of the Flash, and his mind basically breaks. So what he tries to do is convince himself that he is Barry Allen to avoid this, fakes it in front of all Barry's friends and family, and including Wally West, who's the Flash at this time, and eventually Wally gets so pissed off that he beats his brain stupid and he forgets all of these events.
Convenient.
Yeah. He doesn't stop there, though. He became known as a criminal called the Professor, and uses a machine to amplify the energies of Silver Age Barry Allen Flash costume that it's found in the future in a time capsule, and again reverses the colors of the suit, and this would be the first appearance of the alternate suit that we talked about, taking the name Professor Zoom for the first time, and he uses these powers to commit crimes, but gets stopped by Barry Allen, who leaps forward in time to see the capsule being opened because it also contained an atomic clock, which is, much like an atomic bomb, something designed to delete part of time itself as an entity. So the Flash, of course, with his powers, is one of the few people who can put a stop to it and does so. And because of being defeated, Thawne is obsessed now with revenge because he couldn't be a hero. He couldn't even be a criminal right because of the Flash. So he goes back in time and wants to replace Barry again, not only as the Flash, but in Barry Allen's real life. Most people know in comics that Barry Allen's forever love is Iris West, the reporter of Central City who eventually finds out that the Flash and Barry are one and the same, and she's dating Barry and everything works out happy for a little while. Zoom stalks her, approaches her, keeps telling her he's going to be her man. Iris says, "I'm not having this." So what Thawne does is appears at a Halloween party where everybody's in costume and kills her by vibrating his fingers at a speed where they can pass through solid matter, a trick the Flash has mastered, and vibrates his fingers into her brain.
That's gnarly.
Yeah. So then Barry takes years to get his life right after this. Zoom, of course, being Zoom, decides that when Barry finally does have his life together and he's engaged to another girl named Fiona Webb, Zoom's going to do the same thing all over again. And he taunts Barry about it, goes to do it again finally. Barry stops him by catching him at super speed, basically putting him into a cross-faced chicken wing to give you a visual, and apparently breaks Zoom's neck, killing him. He has to go on trial for manslaughter, is eventually found not guilty, even though it's deemed he could have found another way to do it. What happens is you find out in the future that the Thawne family and Allen family had a long-standing rivalry that goes for years and years and years because Thawne is a descendant of Barry Allen's long-lost twin brother who was given up at birth and kind of denied that he ever existed. And it gets very incestuous and crazy when it comes to the time stream, but Zoom is a lethal, murderous, crazy person with the Flash's powers. And while you talked about at the beginning of the show, it's oftentimes said that the Flash is just generalized as a guy who runs really fast. The Flash's speed powers enable him, if he wanted to arguably be the most dangerous person in the world. In Zoom, you get to explore that idea because not only is he, on that same physical prowess that the Flash has, but he's also deranged and quite psychotic with murderous intent. So you get to see the potential of just how dangerous the Flash can be.
Yeah, when I started doing some research into the character, it's a lot more than just, we refer to it as super speed. It's a lot more than that. I mean, the character of the Flash has control over his molecules and can vibrate them at different frequencies. I mean, he can pass through solid matter by and large because he can vibrate himself so fast that he can pass between the molecules that hold things together. It's kind of crazy when you start thinking about it, but there's so much more to the character than this guy runs fast. And that's the fact that he could theoretically just bore his fingers into your skull and destroy your brain without you knowing it happened. I mean, it would be that. I assume it would be done rather quickly since super speed. But that's kind of crazy. Yeah, okay, just as another aside, everybody, I'm going to get a lot of this is going to wind up being kind of an education for me. As I said, my research was not anywhere near complete for this one. All right, so that's kind of the opposite number of the Flash, and sounds suitably the type of villain you need for a character like that. You need someone who can match them either physically or intellectually or what have you. So who would you place next? After Zoom, after the Reverse Flash, who would you say is another one of his heavy hitters?
In terms of, again, if we're going by like threat level, when you use the term heavy hitter, that's what I tend to take from it. I would say Gorilla Grodd. And not a lot of people are very aware that Grodd is a Flash villain from portrayals in recent years. Gorilla Grodd is from a race of super intelligent apes from Gorilla City. And he has massive telepathic powers which allow him to control the minds of almost anybody he makes contact with. Basically what happened was, and it's kind of like been toyed around with what exactly it was, whether it was a spacecraft, a meteor, etc. Something from outer space crashes into Africa where Grodd and his group of apes are, and they're imbued with super intelligence. So what happens is Grodd and another gorilla named Solivar develop further than the others because of their genetic potential, and they become telepathic and telekinetic. And they erect the city, the Gorilla City, and what happens is explorers eventually find this place, and Grodd forces one of the explorers to kill their leader and takes over Gorilla City. And we probably would have had Solivar, who was kind of good-natured, not made contact with the Flash. And in a way, Grodd is almost kind of a comic version of Animal Farm in many respects, the way he and Solivar are thrust into these positions the same way the pigs in Animal Farm are. And we know that's kind of just an animal telling of the story of communism.
Yeah,
but
that's a sad story.
Yeah, but Grodd's an interesting character, not only because of the fact that he's a super intelligent gorilla, and because of the literary things that you see. Grodd is just a guy who's so dangerous because it's not necessarily that he matches up well with the Flash, that he has anything like that. Grodd's the proof that the mind can stop the matter, because he's physically very imposing. He's a gorilla, literally, in every sense of the word, where we use that word to describe bodybuilders or big guys. You combine that with his massive mental powers and a genius-level intellect beyond that, and he's quite dangerous. And it's arguable that he even has superhuman strength beyond, a gorilla's normal strength.
That would make sense. I mean, if you've got super intellect, you could devote a portion of that to finding ways to further enhance your physical attributes.
Yeah, the big reason that the Flash is able to compete with him, and it's interesting because this again dips into the range of the powers of the Flash, is that Grodd's thought process, while it's advanced, still operates at a human rate of speed. And as we know about people who are Flashes, they have superhuman speed, including their thought process. And what this does is this allows them kind of an immunity to Grodd, because Grodd's illusions that he tries to use process in slow motion against them. So the Flash, in many respects, is that great equalizer, because while everybody else is moving at one speed, the entire world is in slow motion to the Flash. And that's one of the reasons he can always trump Grodd and is able to look past what Grodd's doing and can beat him.
That was an aspect of the Flash, their characters, that I actually wasn't aware of, that they think at a different frequency. But that's pretty cool. And yeah, there's a funny thing about when you animate animals and put them on human levels to one degree or another, it can be either very interesting and very awesome from a narrative standpoint, or it can be, less so. And in this case, it's a more interesting version, and I think Superman actually had a gorilla nemesis who shot kryptonite beams from his eyes and was horrible. It was a horrible idea. I got to ask you something about this. It seems like there's you get the running jokes about stuff from be it the Gold or Silver Age, about be it names or the vocabulary used, so on and so forth. What is it with the Flash and all these captains?
I think with the in terms of the captains and all, everybody wants to be noticed. I just think because the Flash deals with a more street level of criminal in a lot of ways, that these are guys who don't necessarily have superpowers, or they luck into what they get. You're not dealing with the most sophisticated level of adversary. And so it's like when you're named the captain on a sports team and you have to wear the big C to let everybody know you're a captain. It's kind of the little dog amongst the big dogs theory where you have to be the loudest to get noticed. So I think when they attach a name like captain to themselves, it's kind of a, hey, look, I'm over here kind of thing. And in fairness to them, captain kind of sounds better and is a little more easy to work with than, say, admiral or lieutenant or, corporal.
You think they could at least got a major in there?
Yeah, majors have made appearances, just never in the Flash's medium. I mean, you've got Major Force against Green Lantern, another few minor majors here and there, oxymoron and intentional, but yeah, the Flash seems to have a thing where it's always the captains who are after him.
Let's tackle a couple of these because there's, like I said, there's more than one. There's like 3 or 4 different captains that the Flash tackles, and you're big time. That's one of those, like, it's the pro wrestling thing where it's reverse psychology. You want to know professional wrestling like Federation or whatnot is kind of gimmicky and not as big as they are. They've named something, and I'm going to steal Chris Jericho's line here, because apparently when he was a kid, he had what he called the Big Time Wrestling Federation. The logic being that if you say you're big time, you're anything but. So let's go with Captain Boomerang first, because I'm like peripherally aware of the character Boomerang from the Marvel universe. So what's up with the Captain Boomerang from the DC universe?
He's a little bit more of a threat, and in actuality, there were 2 Captain Boomerangs, one a father-son duo actually. The original was Digger Harkness, and he was a bastard son of an American soldier and an Australian woman, and grew up poor. So he didn't have means, so in order to hunt and such as a kid for food, he developed great skills with making boomerangs and using them. And eventually, like a lot of people, he used this skill as a profession when he was hired as a performer and a promoter by a toy company that used him to market boomerangs. Unfortunately, he, as would happen in real life, when a guy dresses in a ridiculous costume and is throwing boomerangs around, people ridiculed him. And so he got so pissed off at the world around him that he decided he was going to use this skill to be a criminal and stick it to everybody. And he became a mascot for a toy company, pretended someone was impersonating him after the Flash had caught him, and through this deception almost killed him by preying on his weakness and his good heart by knocking him out with a boomerang. And then, in kind of over-the-top typical Silver Age villain fashion, he tied the Flash to a giant boomerang that he fired that was going to go into space. And
what's the point? It'll just come back.
Exactly. And it was going to fall into the ocean. But the Flash, as you talked about, vibrated so fast and made the boomerang go so fast that he was able to free himself from the bonds that were holding him and jail, Captain Boomerang and the crooks. He never had superhuman abilities like some of the Flash's rogues would get at a certain point. But what he did was, like many criminals, he got gimmicked boomerangs, which had a number of different effects, and would use them fairly ruthlessly, whether it was killing, maiming, what have you. And so that made him a little bit more dangerous than your average stock villain. And eventually, Captain Boomerang just kind of for a little while became a stereotyped Australian, no thanks to the movie Crocodile Dundee, which made everybody think Australians were all pretty much what Paul Hogan was in that movie. And he got a little bit of a rebirth when they came out with a story an eventual comic series called The Suicide Squad, where Captain Boomerang is one of these draftees against his will, where he is brought into this government covert ops team with an implant that will kill him if he rebels, and is put in with these other villains who are given an opportunity to reduce their sentences that they're facing. And you see him develop a little bit more as just this Tommy Kangaroo down sport stereotype. He becomes really evil and selfish, and is shown where you just can't like the guy no matter what. He allows his teammates to be killed when he can easily stop the situation from happening when their ops go bad. He impersonates another of Flash's rogues, the Mirror Master, to stay under the radar of the ops team's superiors so he can retain whatever credit he's earning with them. And even when he's dealing with Bronze Tiger, who's a teammate of his who's black, he constantly uses racial slurs against him, referring to him as an abo, which, if you're not familiar, Australian people look to certain Aboriginal tribes as the same way certain Southern cultures in the United States look to black people in the United States as less than human and have terms for it. The abo is kind of the Australian equivalent of the N-word. Eventually, he's killed in kind of an unceremonious fashion, and his son, his illegitimate son, winds up taking up the mantle and is taken under the wing of another captain, Captain Cold, in the group that, you know, this is about Rogues Galleries the last few weeks. The Flash's Rogues Gallery actually proudly sport the name The Rogues.
Nice.
And he's taken into that group, and very much the same kind of skill set as his father, with boomerangs of various gimmicksing degrees. And again, is taken under the tutelage of the leader of the Rogues, Captain Cold, and is kind of brought along to eventually be a guy who is a better criminal than his father was.
All right. Well, you mentioned Captain Cold, so let's go ahead and dovetail into that.
I love Captain Cold. I make no bones about it. I think Captain Cold is awesome. I think he gets a bad rap because there are so many ice-themed villains. Even just in DC Comics alone, you've got Captain Cold, Killer Frost, the Icicle, Chillbane. But Cold is a little bit different, I think. He's a guy who...
Here's the relevant question. Has he ever built a snowman?
Oh, Jason Teasley has taken over the show, ladies and gentlemen.
I kind of like the gimmick that if that song gets brought up at some point in the most awkward of situations. I'm 90% sure that Sean Comer has worked out a full rendition of that song for the second half of our Saw podcast.
He has not made a snowman, to my knowledge, but he has made a few Icemen, and the way he did this was he was a small-time criminal named Len Snart who grew up in an abusive home with a father who used to beat him on a regular basis, along with his sister, who he always tried to protect. Sought refuge with his grandfather, who actually ran an ice delivery truck. A little bit of foreshadowing there in his origin. And as a small-time crook, he got busted by the Flash. Read a news report that suggested that cryonics could stop the Flash and cause him a great deal of problems. So what Snart did was he wound up helping to develop and eventually stealing a gun that creates instant cold. And this gun, what it did was it hardened the particles of moisture in the air around its particular target, encasing them in ice. And there were varying levels of the gun he could use, but eventually he used this to slow the Flash down and pull off crimes. And Captain Cold was a very recurring villain in Flash.
Tell me we at least got the comic version of the banana peel with the ice puddle on the ground.
We absolutely did in his first appearance as Captain Cold in Showcase, and he's actually the second super villain that the Silver Age Flash, Barry Allen ever came across in the series Showcase. But Leonard Snart was such a recurring villain as Captain Cold that when the Super Friends Challenge of the Super Friends series went to air, and they needed specific villains for each hero, despite a pretty lengthy Rogues Gallery even at this point in time, Captain Cold was chosen as the Flash's primary adversary to appear as a member of the Legion of Doom. So it says something about his standing that they picked him. And Snart eventually, when dealing with the other members of the Rogues, would become their de facto leader, not because of an icy cold demeanor, but because of more a sense of obligation, a take-no-nonsense kind of approach, and the fact that of the Rogues, he's probably had more success as a criminal than any of the others. And even as the leader, he puts his hammer down, and he has rules such as no drugs, and that's evident when the second Mirror Master, a Scottish fella, has a cocaine habit. Captain Cold beats him half to death, with just his hands, mind you. He will dock you 90% of your payout cut if you engage in what he deems to be senseless violence, an issue he had with the Trickster when the Trickster was using T-bombs and attaching them to stray dogs.
Yeah, I'd take issue with that.
And he's not really a murderous guy. He just wants to make a buck. For example, another Flash rogue named the Top. He had reemerged as a criminal, took the newer existing rogues and put them against Cold and his established rogues, and eventually had to kill the Top because he saw no other way out of this. And he puts down a strict "I will not kill women or children" rule. He also had a sister who became a criminal known as the Golden Glider, and what she had was this pair of ice skates that could allow her to glide on the air. And while she was a pretty lame villain on her own, she served as a decent plot device for Captain Cold to show that he kind of is not Mr. Freeze and that he does have a heart, he does care. And when she's murdered by a villain named Chilbane, another guy using Cold gimmicks, that's when Captain Cold kind of snaps and murders him. And Captain Cold is shown to frequent a usual prostitute at this point in time, and after he does this, he's sitting at home drinking alone, and when she comes to the door, he won't do it and says, "Why? Because my heart's not always cold." He's also one of the few Flash villains who was able to appear in the live-action Flash TV show. They changed him a little bit and made him into a kind of high-tech mafia hitman, where he was an albino man who used a nuclear-powered gun to kill his victims. And he was basically brought in to kill the Flash, and the Flash, of course, manages to capture him. He's not Leonard Snart to call him Leonard Winters to kind of make it more ironic. But Cold has been a constant. Cold has been a constant among the villains. His origin, and even in the new continuity, is very much the same. And he's still going to be that guy, but they've changed him in many ways now, and as they have to a lot of the rogues, where he does have superhuman powers now because of an experiment that the rogues agreed to kind of merge them in their weaponry. So he does have what would be referred to, I guess, as cryokinetic powers at this point. But he's every hero, has some villain where even if they're not the A-squad guy and are not the most dangerous, they'll always show up and always pose a threat and always make the reader intrigued as to what the goings-on are. And Cold was always that guy. And when he was established as the undisputed leader of the rogues, that made him seem like a bigger deal because of that, because he had all these guys operating under his rules. Despite that there was seemingly nothing that would separate them on a power level, the fact that he was the one reining everybody in and and calling the shots showed that there was something different about Cold that got him to a different level than everybody else.
Well, he was the captain. Nobody outranked him.
The captain of captains.
There we go. There were at least two other captains in the rogues. He had seniority. I had a thought of that. I had something I wanted to ask you about that. It'll come back to me, or it won't, and we'll just keep going. All right. You brought up another one that I know we kind of wanted to bring up, and for maybe different reasons, but you mentioned the Trickster in that when discussing Captain Cold. Oh, I remember. Very briefly, apparently Captain Cold was ranked higher by, IGN? Some website or group that creates lists to get hits on their website, and that covers a lot of ground. But apparently they actually ranked him higher than Zoom. So I'm curious, would you agree with that ranking overall, or?
No, I would still put Professor Zoom ahead of Captain Cold. Not by a huge margin or anything. I think Captain Cold is a quality villain, but I would absolutely put him ahead. Put Professor Zoom ahead of Captain Cold, and I would put Captain Cold ahead of Zoom's successor, Zoom, who just goes by the name of Zoom.
Well, let's see. The second generation is rarely as good as the originals. You brought up
Yeah,
the trickster when you brought up the trickster in that last little bit, and I know you wanted to bring him up, and I do too. And part of that is because the great Matt Hamill.
No, you're right.
No, I'm right, Mark. Yeah, I get those two confused. They sound so much alike. Sorry, Mark.
Not when they talk.
So Mark Hamill, who Luke Skywalker, and very famously has done phenomenal voice work with the Joker, played the trickster in the live-action television series. So tell me about this character. You just mentioned that he put bombs on stray dogs just to cause random havoc.
Yeah, and again, like a lot of Flash villains, there's an original and a successor to him. In this case, the original is James Jesse, and that's the trickster most people know. And he is originally a circus acrobat. And what happens is every member of his family, kind of similar to the Graysons, of who we got Robin / Nightwing / operative for the government now. Every member of his family was a trapeze expert, and his father wanted him to go into it. Instead, he wanted to just make people laugh and have fun. And eventually he gets a little bit crazy. And so what he starts doing is building what are referred to eventually as gag gadgets that he uses to commit crimes. What eventually happens is the Flash and the Trickster's initial crime spree has to guess eventually that, he keeps wearing this stupid Harlequin costume that you can probably only find in a circus. I'm going to the nearby circus, and sure enough, he finds him. And even though the Flash is not a trapeze artist and moving at super speed on one of those would suggest it would probably be a little dangerous, he eventually gets to the high level with a pogo stick and catches him.
Okay. I'm not sure if that's awesome or horrible.
I can tell you that it sounds horrible, but looking at it is just awesome.
All right. And
he continues to be this nutty pain in the behind of the Flash for years until Barry Allen dies, and eventually he reforms to a certain extent, and what he does is he winds up being a collector of supervillain weapons, and because he deems such things too dangerous to exist and shouldn't be in free hands, and he's right. The problem is he doesn't safeguard his own stuff, and eventually another person looking to emulate him named Axel Walker takes on the mantle of the trickster. And Axel, of course, is just, while Jesse was kind of a fun nuisance, the same way, say, a Riddler is to a Batman, Axel Walker takes that step from Riddler to Joker, where he's just kind of insanely murderous and finds it really fun to do so. And he takes on the mantle of the trickster, comes up with new toys and things that are even more deadly, and it kind of becomes just an indiscriminate murderer until he finally wants to show he's a legitimate rogue and break into Captain Cold's gang. And when he's figuring out how to do it, he goes to the Mirror Master for advice. And he says, you don't tell Cold why you want to be here, you tell him why you need to be here. And to prove himself, he participates in the murder of one of the Flash's allies, Inertia. And what happens from there is he just kind of is the de facto storyline trickster, while James Jesse is seen as reformed and does whatever murderous deed he can and laughs about it. And in that respect, he's kind of become a poor man's Joker, and that's why I prefer the James Jesse version, and that's the version that Mark Hamill portrayed in the live-action TV series. And we talk about Mark Hamill often as playing the Joker in the Batman animated series, and it's rightfully raved about his performance. If you want to see a live-action version of that, watch his appearances in the Flash TV show as the Trickster, because he is just so over the top, so fun, and just throws himself into this so without ego or anything that he is a perfect trickster, which is just so awesome. He kind of coerces a court stenographer into becoming his accomplice, and you find out she was not a court stenographer, she was a plant, and she's the owner of a toy company, and she's a huge fan of his work. So in the same sense, you get that Harley Quinn portrayal before you ever see a Harley Quinn or find out who she was. They kind of had that idea in place, too, in this TV show. And so anybody who thinks that that is the Joker in the Batman animated series is just the greatest thing Mark Hamill's ever done, watch it play out live if he'd have really gotten to perform the role on the Flash TV show as the Trickster.
What's his sidekick's name? Please tell me something stupid. Yes, I was correct. It was something stupid.
Much in the vein of the 60s Batman TV show.
Yes. It doesn't stop it from being at least partway awesome. All right. Okay. I come across this a couple of times when looking at the Trickster. I'm browsing through Wikipedia by and large while we're talking about this stuff. It seems like there was some kind of connection between the Trickster and the Pied Piper.
Yeah, there was. The Pied Piper was another Flash villain, and basically the Pied Piper was born deaf, and through some experiments at the behest of his father, eventually they restored his hearing via a lot of musical attempts, and Piper becomes fascinated by sound and the effect it can have on people, and develops a pipe weapon that allows him, much like the Pied Piper of legend, to control the minds of people. And he's a constant pain in the Flash's rear end for a while, doing things like using his sound waves to make the Flash vibrate at a certain frequency where he loses his memory and can't remember who he is because his face is vibrating. Yeah, and also because the Flash's face is vibrating, he doesn't know which one is his real face. So he plays a good little joke on that. But Piper has a conscience, and it's ultimately his downfall as a villain, and allows him to reform and kind of becomes like a man on the street, kind of street source for information for the Wally West version of the Flash. And Piper's also notable in that he's one of the first comic book characters to ever be openly gay, which was revealed in the 90s. And he makes the ironic joke about it that he's also one of the first villains to go straight.
Yeah,
what happened was you found out that Barry Allen, the Flash of the Silver Age, had asked the magic partitioner Zatanna, who's a superheroine, and for my money, the sexiest comic character there's ever been. I don't know, maybe it's the fishnet stockings, but after the identity crisis storyline, where you find out that some members of the Justice League had participated in mind-wiping and mind-altering the villain Dr. Light and some of their own friends to erase painful memories of a certain event, that the Flash had asked Zatanna to erase the memories of certain villains and allow them to reform. And the Piper was one of them, the Trickster was one of them, the Top was one of them, and the Top's programming eventually breaks in that respect, and he restores the memories of people like the Piper and the Trickster. The thing is, the Piper and Trickster don't really want to go back to their lives of villainy because they're not genuinely bad people in their personalities. And what they try to do is infiltrate the rogues under the guise of making the rogues believe they intend to become full-time criminals again. They're found out and on the run from almost everybody, from the rogues to Lex Luthor's Secret Society of Supervillains, and eventually what happens is they're placed in these handcuffs by Amanda Waller's Suicide Squad that give them 5 feet of length between each other, but if the handcuffs should be tampered with, they will explode and kill them. So eventually they're brought to Apocalypse by Desaad, who is the right-hand man of Darkseid, and that's how deep this gets, where if they are, he feels that in Darkseid's lifelong quest for the anti-life equation, Piper's music may have something to be able to do it. Because they don't need the Trickster, and the Trickster makes a joke that offends Desaad, Desaad eventually threatens to kill the Trickster. And Piper doesn't want that to happen, so Piper starts playing the anti-life equation, gets the equation to explode Desaad's head. Trickster gives his life eventually to stop Piper from being killed by a hail of bullets, and Piper just kind of drags his corpse as far as he can at a certain point. And it's kind of sad in a lot of ways because they were trying to do the right thing and eventually ended up in the case of the Trickster, dead for it. But the Piper has kind of remained very much kind of one of the few guys who ever reformed and stuck to it. Even though he was constantly against his will manipulated into trying to be a villain again, he's always fought against it. And actually wound up probably being one of the more appreciative portrayals of a homosexual character in comics, in that he's not flamboyant, he's not inherently bad. He actually does the right thing often, and is probably a guy who a lot of people of the gay culture who are comic book fans can appreciate.
All right. Well, you can only get better from Shocker, right?
Oh, speaking of fishnets in a bad context.
Yeah. You've brought up the Top a couple of different times, so let's go to him for a little bit here. What's up with him?
The Top is a guy named Roscoe Dillon, and when you're going to have a character like the Flash, one of the things you have to do is have, a villain who can compete with the Flash's speed. And Roscoe Dillon has the ability to kind of spin, like a Top would suggest, at superhuman speeds. And what this also does, apparently, is allow him to have increased intelligence. And you find out why. It's because of the stimulation of his brain cells. And what it also eventually does is give him telekinetic and telepathic powers. He also, of course, as a standard for a villain, uses gimmicked tops with things like glue, explosives, oils, and gases. They never really allowed him to really be a crazy villainous equivalent to the Flash up until they had him come up with a plot that he figured out while he was spinning he was getting more intelligent. So what he did was he used that to come up with an idea. And what he came up with an idea for was an atomic grenade top, which would allow him to basically destroy half the known populace of the world by destroying the land masses. And eventually the Flash is able to figure it out and stop him.
All right. Well, and isn't proximity to the Flash's super speed, doesn't that retard the effects of his super spinning as far as his intellect goes?
Well, what happens with the Flash is the Flash has an ability to, because of his connection to the Speed Force, to do what's called stealing speed. And eventually, while a super speedster is in proximity to the Flash, the closer he gets to them, the faster he can go and slow them down. So that's part of it.
Okay.
But the Top actually had some moments where he went beyond gimmicky villain, where Barry Allen's parents were killed in a car accident. The Top's spirit was able to take possession of Barry's father, Henry. And what happened was he manipulated his girlfriend, the sister of Captain Cold's Golden Glider. He wanted to use this when he found out who the Flash was because of taking over the body. He wanted to use this to kill the Flash and take over his body. The problem is he does it while the Flash is still alive, not realizing the Flash isn't dead yet, and Henry Allen's spirit rightfully goes back into its body and freezes the Top out. But the Top somehow remains a spirit and takes over comatose bodies, and the last straw comes when he digs up the grave of the Flash's late wife, Iris Allen. And Barry's just so distraught that this is what leads to him doing the eventual mind wiping of villains, because he doesn't want that to happen ever again. And he takes Dillon to the Justice League Watchtower and gets Zatanna to alter his mind. And what happens is they turn him into a hero at first, not even just wipe his memories of his villainy, but turn him into a hero. And he gets so distraught by the guilt of knowing what he did in the past that he goes crazy. And he's the one who starts to use mental programs to, forcibly reform the other rogues. And it works until he steps into another person's body and the mind wiping is done, because that physical brain hasn't been altered.
No, at least it makes sense.
Yeah, to some extent.
It's the realm of the fantastic. All you need is enough of a excuse to keep paying attention. All right. You mentioned Mirror Master a couple of times, and again, I'm assuming there's at least two of them. So, wasn't he the one they used in the animated version of the Tower of Babel storyline?
Yes, he was.
Was he? Oh, he was voiced by Alexis Denisof in that, if my memory serves me correctly.
You are
Which
2 for 2, Mr. Winfree.
Which is always a plus for me, because that poor guy does not get enough work.
No, forever Wesley Wyndham Price, forever nobody else, unfortunately, for the talented Alexis Denisof. But he did get to portray the Mirror Master. Yeah, for all of a minute and a half.
Well, not under a mountain of prosthetic effects, but still. He cashed the check, right? I mean, that's the phrase.
I guess, and there's always his working wife, so he's not in bad shape.
That's true. All right, anyway, about the Mirror Master.
You are correct that there are two versions. The original was Sam Scudder. The follower was Evan McCullough. Sam Scudder is a Mirror Master who learned his powers because he was obsessed with trying to get inside the reflection of a mirror, figuring that mirrors had inert properties to alternate dimensions. And after he went into a hall of mirrors, he kept experimenting, and found a way that he could use his own reflection to enter a mirror. Basically, this high technological mastery allowed him certain things that he could manipulate with mirrors to produce different effects, one of them being invisibility, one of them being holograms, that he could project images that weren't there with the mirrors. He could hypnotize you with the constant mirror images. And again, he could use this to eventually find his goal of traveling into other dimensions and using mirrors as a mode of transport between these dimensions to all of a sudden be in a bank vault in Central City, robbing the place, and could use a mirror to transport right back to his hideout, which made him a very difficult foe for the Flash, because while the Flash could move at super speed, he had no way often of predicting how or where Mirror Master would be, where he would go, and whether or not he was actually facing the Mirror Master or a projection of him to some extent. Scudder was the original. He died during the crisis on Infinite Earths, and like I said, the Captain Boomerang eventually assumed the Mirror Master identity, and kind of to frame him eventually. The Rogues eventually find a youngster by the name of Evan McCullough, who was an orphan from Scotland and was molested by an older boy, which led to Evan committing his first murder in self-defense. He was never caught for it, and he fled from the orphanage at 16, with the only thing he had being a photograph of his biological parents. He becomes an assassin throughout the United Kingdom and hurts his eye. So he can't figure out who his target is. He just takes the shot and does it, and eventually realizes that he was hired to kill his father. Keeps trying to work up the courage to see what he can do as far as seeing his parents to try to make it right, and instead gets picked up by a branch of the U.S. government who are in bed with big business and offer him the costume and weapons of Sam Scudder in exchange for his experience and services, because basically they figure this guy was so dangerous that if we can bring in another pro who has a higher level of skill than this guy did with that technology, we've got something great. And they manipulate him into trying to scare Animal Man, another superhero, into abandoning an animal rights stance, which he fails at due to Animal Man's wife. This leads to him being fired by the U.S. government and replaced because he wouldn't kill Animal Man's wife and kids. He kind of becomes a hero and puts to rest these government big goons who try to stop him, but he realizes he needs money, so he becomes a supervillain for hire and bases himself eventually at a Keystone City where the current Flash, Wally West, was operating, and remasters Scudder's abilities and just basically becomes the new Mirror Master, a more dangerous version of the original who had less of an understanding of the technology, but a more skilled reputation that goes along with it. But succumbs, as I said earlier, to drug addiction and eventually gets a rehab in the form of Captain Cold beating him to death, near to death with his fists.
Okay. I'm just reading his brief bio synopsis. Okay, he was with Lex Luthor. Oh, Batman paid him off. I don't know why, but that's kind of awesome. There's something pure about a supervillain who can be bought. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
No, it's not. It's listen. These are guys, especially with a reputation like the second Mirror Master, where he was a merc for hire. It kind of only makes sense. And Batman's smart enough to deduce who this guy is. And, of course, he's got the billionaire dollars to back him up. Why wouldn't he do that? It's just so much easier at that point to just say, hey, here's a bunch of money. Do this.
I've bruised my knuckles enough bashing people's skulls in today. Just here's my checkbook. Go away.
You kind of almost wonder why he hasn't done it before. It makes you think he does have a little bit of a sadistic streak because he could probably do that to a lot of people, but just chooses to beat them up instead.
Well, I imagine it's a cathartic experience.
Not that I would know about that.
Oh, come on. You've punched a few people in your time.
I suppose.
Not that you have the deep emotional trauma or anything, but...
No, certainly not. That's another podcast.
One that you'll have to host with Mark, because he's the head shrinker. All right, there's a few other either temperature or weather-related villains that I think we could probably touch on here. What's up with Heatwave? Since we've covered Captain Cold, it only seems fair that we talk about Heatwave.
Again, much in the same vein as Captain Cold, he's a guy who uses temperature-themed weaponry, although, as the name would imply, as opposed to Captain Cold, his fascination is with fire. And he is a pyromaniac who, as a kid, burned his family's house down. And instead of trying to help or anything, he's so mystified and almost entranced by the flame that he just watched his whole family die inside the fire. He is a real sadistic kind of pyro where he murders a schoolmate by locking him in his house and setting it on fire as revenge for the boy locking him in a meat locker during a school trip. He got a job with a circus, which you think would finally kind of sustain him a little bit, because what trick is he performing in the circus? He's a fire eater. And instead what he does, nope, I set the circus on fire. You find out that he's so obsessed with fire that it makes him insanely afraid of cold. And again, this goes back to that school field trip where he was locked inside a meat freezer. And so it motivates him that he has to use this mania to some extent. And after seeing some of the rogues in action in Central City, he decides, that's what I can do. I can use my talent, I guess you'd call it, for pyrotechnics to become a villain and make some money, and I'll be great. It'll be perfect. So he makes this suit out of asbestos in the Silver Age, mind you. It's been changed since then, because in the 1960s we didn't know what the dangers of asbestos were, folks. We know them now, so of course the origin has been changed accordingly.
Oh, come on. We could do a great story like where he's got cancer.
They've done that with other people, and one more will not help. But, and the gravity of Lex Luthor catching it from a kryptonite ring, the asbestos suit would just kind of make Heatwave look like an idiot at this point in time. But, he uses a big flamethrower and eventually becomes a regular recurring foe of the Flash. His dislike of Cold, of course, would lead him into a rivalry of sorts with Captain Cold. And eventually Captain Cold just kind of slaps him in the head and tries to knock some sense into him and say, look, you've got this ability, I've got this ability, we're both doing the same thing over and over again. Get over it, start working with me, and maybe we've got a shot at making something happen here. And it's Cold who recruits him into the Rogues, to oppose the Flash. And in his first appearance with the Rogues, they team up, but eventually they compete over the affections of a newscaster working in Central City that they both fell in love with. And so despite them working together to try to have this large crime spree at place, they keep ending up at odds with each other over this newscaster. Because at the end of the day, they're both men, and men are simple creatures, as Robert and I will both attest to. And because of this, it makes it really easy for the Flash to jail them both. He's one of the guys who the top eventually brainwashed into becoming straight and took a job as a consultant for volunteer fire squads and how to fight them. And he actually became really good friends with the civilian identity of the Flash, Barry Allen. And what happens is eventually the futuristic villain, Abracadabra, finally just preys on him and tempts him enough that he would gain respect and infamy, and agrees to get him to sell his soul to Neron, who is a demon, basically DC's version of Mephisto, kind of their devil incarnate. And what happens is their power scales up incredibly. They wreak havoc, death, and destruction. But the Flash eventually gets Neron to kind of bring them back down to earth in not so many ways and bring them back to who they were. And Heatwave again then finds himself basically as a jobber among Flash villains and kind of just tries to reform in many ways. He studies with monks. He works for Project Cadmus. But he finally breaks when the top completely undoes the mental programming that he put into him and becomes a member of the secret society of supervillains and eventually the Rogues, and just goes back to his old ways.
Well, change is hard.
Maybe it's the asbestos causing some ill effects we may not have even counted on.
Oh, yeah, who knows? It's asbestos. It's got all kinds of wacky properties. All right. I think that covers a fair number of... Who else did I want to talk about? Oh, who was it? Hang on. I had it over here. One of the original... Oh, okay. The other one, one of the earlier ones, I suppose, would... since this indicates he was introduced in the Gold Age. But tell me about the Shade.
Yeah, the Shade, and that's a villain going back to the days of the original Flash in terms of publication history. Jay Garrick, who his Flash story is a little bit different. He's not a super speedster by virtue of a destined accident. He has a chemical reaction to some, I believe what's called hard chemicals that he's experimenting with, and passes out and wakes up, and all of a sudden he's got super speed. He eventually did become a villain of the Silver Age Flash as well. He even appears in cartoons. Basically, in the Golden Age, he's a villain who has this cane that can manipulate shadows around him and create kind of a living darkness. He is a constant foe of the Flash because even though Jay Garrick, like all Flashes, can move at super speed, he can't catch what he can't see. And because of that, it causes some problems. He's eventually reborn in 1994 after the Zero Hour event where all of history was changed in DC. And they change him into a Victorian-esque English gentleman who is born in the 1800s and is part of some mystic happening that kills over 100 people that he survives. And what happens is he loses all his memory prior to that, and what happens is he's taken in by a guy named Ludlow in a carriage and brought in. And what the plan is while he's given all this kindness, it's a setup where this Ludlow is part of a family that are killers and thieves, and what they do is they kill one of their partners, have a vagrant killed in the vicinity to give the idea of a robbery homicide. What they wanted to do was use Swift as the scapegoat, the Shade, and he unleashed what they didn't realize were hidden powers within him with these shadows, killing everybody present. So he's kind of a villain who's had a redone history to some extent. His powers are essentially those of being able to use this cane in the original days, and later on when you find out it's an inherent power within him, the cane is a focus point for those powers. And what happens is he kind of uses a malleable darkness that he can channel in the absence of light to summon and control what are called shadow demons. And he can create constructs out of them or block things out. And he's a weird kind of character because of that, because his origin's been so vastly changed. And he eventually went from being a Flash villain to showing up in the Starman book that was a Vertigo imprint for DC, which is more their adult line in the 90s and early 2000s. And they make him into a very odd, spacey kind of character where he exists in the future too, and that he draws powers from a divine entity called the Great Evil Beast, who is assumed to be Satan, and his only weakness is that when he's in the presence of light, when his shadow is lost, his physical form is vulnerable. Not a great villain necessarily. I think he's kind of too far out there for his own good in many ways. But the simplistic version, who fought the Jay Garrick Flash and early years Barry Allen, and was shown in the Justice League's cartoon series and the Justice League Unlimited cartoon series, is much truer to that respect. And I think that's a little bit more fun to deal with.
All right. That was kind of one of the reasons I wanted to bring him up, because I'd seen him in some of those cartoons, and yeah, he looked like he had some of the stuff in Vertigo was a little bit out there, just a smidge. But, you know, they also gave us some great stuff, particular, you know, line of comics. All right, was there anything? Okay, I think that's everything I had specifically wanted to cover that I had come across. I'm fairly sure I'm missing several guys. So who comes up? Who haven't we talked about that you want to hit on, Pat?
I mean, you know, there are always guys you can go into as far as like Weather Wizard, Dr. Alchemy, but we've really covered the main villains who plague the Flash at a significant threat level or like on a continual basis. The thing about the Flash's rogues gallery, and it is kind of a general point to me, is that while you can look at his villains and write off a lot of them as not major threats, and maybe his rogues gallery isn't as well known as, say, that of Batman or Spider-Man, they're probably the two most well known in comics, I would say. But at the same time, he has such an extensive rogues gallery of guys with differing abilities and themes and threat levels, and the fact that his rogues are actually willing to team with each other and operate under the name of the Rogues to a certain extent of success. It's almost kind of unique in that they're willing to accept this title and operate as such when they know their place and their role in some ways. And that's what kind of makes this one of the great rogues galleries in all of comics, is it's so diverse. It's always forever plaguing him. It's so varied in what it brings to the table that there's a lot of fun to be had. And when you get a good writer involved in it, like a Mark Waid, who wrote the majority of the Wally West era as Flash, or Jeff Johns, who is writing the later issues of the Wally West Flash and eventually the Rebirth series that reintroduced Barry Allen into the concurrent DC universe at that time. It's really, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. It's got so much potential to it, and when that potential is unleashed, that rogues gallery stands as arguably the very best because of the varied threats, because of the personalities and the conflicts internally between them, and because of what they're able to do to the Flash, and not just one Flash, but several generations, going through Barry Allen, who was the first to really have that established rogues gallery, and passed it on to Wally West, who passed it on to Bart Allen, and now in the New 52, it's come full circle where they're all operating under these aliases again and plaguing Barry Allen's version of the Flash, who will probably eventually have to pass it on again to Wally West at a certain point. But it's so comprehensive and comes at you at so many levels that I think the Flash's rogues gallery is probably not at all appreciated the way it should be. And that's a shame, because there are a lot of good characters in there with, and it's not necessarily their villainous gimmicks that make them, but when they're written under their actual personalities inside those costumes, they become much more interesting than the majority of other villains out there. Be it, you know, the childhood trauma of the Mirror Master, the second Mirror Master that led to him being an assassin, or Captain Cold, who had this dedication to family, and kind of that's what motivates him a little bit to take charge of the Rogues and be a father to the fatherless in some respects. Or even something simplistic like Captain Boomerang, who got ridiculed for his skill set and grew up in poverty and just wanted to stick it to people. There's different motivations for all of them, and all of them have unique personalities due to it. But at the end of the day, they're all still united against this common thread of the one guy who always bests them, the Flash. And even when they team up to try to stop him, they still have to try to put things aside, because this group works more as a team unit than any other Rogues Gallery in comics. Every once in a while you get an Injustice Gang formation, or a Masters of Evil group lineup will plague the Avengers, or the Fantastic Four will see some variation of the Frightful Four. Flash generally, when dealing with one rogue, is dealing with at least one other rogue, if not several more, or all of them to a point. And when you can bring that to the table when they're really at their most dangerous, tend to make for the better Flash stories, because you get character development from the Flash in facing these odds that you don't often get when it's just one and he has to figure out what their scheme is and put a stop to it. And a good villain will always make a good hero more interesting. A lot of good villains will keep a hero more interesting, and I think that's what you see when the Rogues are out and in force against the Flash, in my opinion. Because there's guys who aren't necessarily Rogue members like Zoom, like Grodd, and they can pose that different kind of threat. And Grodd's been written out in recent years for the most part, but Professor Zoom is ever present, and there's differing levels to Flash's villainy, but when the Rogues are in business, it's a big story and usually lasts for several issues for a good reason. And I always enjoy reading those stories, and I think when handled right, they're probably the better Flash stories you can read outside of the early exploits of Professor Zoom.
Yeah, well, you kind of touched on something there, that when you get various levels, you can attack a hero. He can be assaulted on more than one front, and that creates not only a dynamic story, but a more dynamic character when everything is handled properly. And it's to the credit of the characters, theoretically, that they're able to acknowledge that individually they don't have much of a chance, but two or three of them, things get a bit more interesting. And because individually you don't have the power or the menace of someone, like Zoom or Lex Luthor or Doom or any of the other, great standalone villains, but you get two or three of those guys working together, and you've got, you're on par with with a single, near top level villain. So, kudos to everyone kind of involved in that. All right, you mentioned this beforehand at the top of the at the top of the show, that the CW is kind of going to be has announced they're bringing a Flash television series back to, because they've got the Arrow series going on, which focuses on Green Arrow. So now they're going to have the Flash one come in, and they're going to kind of, hopefully it'll be successful. I mean, it's the CW. The expectations are relatively low, so you can kind of move on with I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily. It's just, it's not a huge network, so you don't need huge ratings or huge followings. For crying out loud, they slogged on stuff like One Tree Hill and the Vampire Diaries long past their expiration date, and we're still making money off of it. So there's a good chance we'll be okay here with the Flash getting a decent run and a decent story behind it. So I'm just curious, first couple of episodes of the television series, what villain would you use to kind of kick things off? Who do you want to see first?
Well, I happen to know, and they've made an announcement that they've cast Rick Cosnett, who I don't know anything he's done, unfortunately, but he's being cast in the role of Eddie Thawne, who, of course, is the alias of Professor Zoom. So I think they're doing a similar thing to Arrow in that they established that Arrow's main foe in the show was going to be Deathstroke, but he was not the initial threat. He was kind of the omnipresent threat to the viewer that the main hero was not aware of until eventually they decided to make a big move. If you're including villains early on into this show for The Flash, I think you kind of have to, even though he's got a ton of rogues, I'd like to see them space out the appearances between the more major members of that gallery. I love Captain Cold. I don't want to see him in, 3 of the first 9 episodes. Have him make an appearance or two in the first season. Same thing with a guy like the Trickster, for example. Let him have kind of a Jobber of the Week kind of build in the show, where you have lesser villains that he's dealt with over time. Like, why not bring in the Turtle Man, whose power was moving super slow and negated the Flash's speed, that made him incredibly frustrating to deal with.
That's kind of awesome. I mean, it's stupid on some levels, but that's kind of awesome.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason he was chosen as kind of the first opponent for the Flash, is they couldn't figure out how necessarily to really challenge a guy with super speed. How about a guy who's super slow? And it's kind of what I refer to now as the Keith Jardine principle, where you can't time Keith Jardine when you fight him because he makes such slow and awkward movements that even though you see what's coming at you, it still lands because there's no way of timing it properly. And that's why you kind of have to bull rush him and get him out early. That's the problem the Flash deals with, and the Flash's character is not to be a super quick thinker. He's a methodical operator because he's a forensic scientist for the police department. He wants to cover everything before he makes a move, which is part of the fun of the Flash, and that his personality is in diametric opposite of his power. And so why not throw a villain like that in? Take a Heat Wave, who you could eventually bring in on an episode with Captain Cold and introduce him and what his thing is. Just don't put him in an asbestos suit because you will look like an idiot for writing that into the show. Even a Pied Piper you can introduce early and maybe build a narrative where eventually he does reform, because they never introduced him in the old live-action series. The only villains they introduced either directly or a kind of a hidden version of were the Trickster, played by Mark Hamill, the version of Captain Cold, and a kind of version of the Mirror Master who was portrayed by Danny Partridge himself, David Cassidy, which is not the most menacing actor you can find to threaten somebody.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I could find infants with more menace than Mr. Cassidy there.
No offense to you, David. You're a terrific singer, and you've got a great little fan base of, 40-plus women who will do anything they can to meet you because they still love you. I was being nice. I don't want to age the women that badly.
It's a question of chronology, not a knock on any of the women.
He married Kay Lenz at one point, though, so good for him, because she used to be a nice piece of tail.
Hey, you know what? He's a guy who seems to have, known where his bread is buttered, so to speak, and he's perfectly happy just making his money doing that.
Yeah, but again, CW, if you're listening, and we know that there are spies everywhere listening to our shows based on the UFC's moves and several other moves we've seen, do not cast somebody like who's a modern-day David Cassidy for our time, Robert.
I don't know. Channing Tatum?
Maybe not Channing Tatum. Maybe Taylor Lautner.
Okay, I can. I just had this debate with one of my brothers the other day about. I refer to them as the exponentially replaceable actors, and it consists of Taylor Kitsch, Channing Tatum, Lucas Black, and who was the other one we decided on? I forget who the other one was. Taylor Lautner fit into that group if he was doing anything, but point being, avoid those people.
Avoid them. Do not cast them. Cast somebody either we don't know or somebody who can do the role quite well. Look to your people who've played murderers and gotten good reviews on shows like Law & Order SVU, shows like that. Stay away from Teen Fair and things of that nature. Please, please, I'm begging you.
Hey, hire Alexis Denisof. The man needs work.
He could be a methodical, calculating killer.
Yeah, that's why I'm suggesting it. He'd be good for the role, and the man needs to work. Poor guy.
And he's already technically played Mirror Master. It works.
It does. It works wonderfully. All right. We've given our advice to the people at the CW, who will no doubt roundly ignore us, because that's kind of what they do, much like Fox did when casting everyone in the new Fantastic Four movie. We gave you ideas, people. I know there were spies and interns listening. Instead, you got techno-hipster douches all the way around. Good for
And again,
you.
listen, We don't have a great legal department that will prove on any grounds that you stole these ideas from us, and we don't really want to sue you either. We just want the best quality product we can get. Please use our ideas. This is verbal consent you're getting right now. When we throw you a fastball over the plate, dead center, please swing your bat and hit it out of the park.
We'll provide written consent, too, if necessary. We're
Yeah,
available.
we'll get it notarized.
Folks. I know a notary.
I am a notary.
Good for you. Yeah, we'll get things notarized. Come on, people. We're giving you good ideas here. It's gold. All right. Pat, thanks for being on. What do you got? This is 2 weeks in a row for you. You were here for Thor last week, too.
What can I say? I'm just the comic renaissance man, where I did a lot of reading as a kid, and most of it was of the $1.99 variety that you could pick up at your local newsstand, as opposed to the works of Henry David Thoreau, William Faulkner, and the like.
You're kind of better off not reading Faulkner. That man rambles.
And it's depressing. I actually did get to read Heart of Darkness at a certain point.
That's Conrad.
Ah, okay. Faulkner wrote the other one.
As I Lie Dying is kind of his...
That is it. That was in my American Modernism course.
I actually like both of those, but, oh, God, Heart of Darkness. It's like a physical task reading that book. Don't get me wrong, it's worth it. And I very much enjoy it, but it's a almost physical effort. So don't undertake that lightly.
Yeah, I will tell most people you can usually find a version of these made into a film, usually starring Orson Welles.
That's probably true. In the case of Heart of Darkness, you have Marlon Brando.
Close enough, that guy.
Yes, yes. Another fat guy. All right. So, what do you got to plug this week, Pat?
Well, you can go on over to the Casual Heroes and listen to myself and Gavin Napier give you a complete breakdown of the fallout from the rematch between Manny Pac-Man Pacquiao and Timothy Desert Storm Bradley. We also preview tomorrow night's upcoming bout between the ageless wonder Bernard the Alien Hopkins and Babut Shumanov as they try to unify their light heavyweight championships on Showtime. You can also hear me, as usual, on the 411 Ground and Pound radio show every Sunday with our host with the most, Robert Winfree. You can also go ahead and, as Robert mentioned, listen to last week's Everyone Loves a Bad Guy that we recorded, talking about the rogues gallery of my favorite comic book superhero, the Mighty Thor.
All right. Okay, quick question. What are the odds the boxing match this week ends in a draw? Just because unifying titles can't happen.
You know what? I'll honestly give it like a 30-1 shot.
As Pat mentioned, the 411 Ground and Pound radio show is live every Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern. This week we've got 2 cards to review. One already happened. Michael Bisping showed a startling amount of ring rust in his loss to Tim Kennedy. There were a couple of pointless Tough finales and some other fights on the Tough Nations finale this week, so we'll be reviewing that. We'll probably poke some fun at The Ultimate Fighter, because apparently no one cares, which is about right. Seriously, lowest rated debut for a Tough season in show history as far as the U.S. version goes. I'm not making that up. We'll also be reviewing UFC on Fox 11, headlined by Fabricio Verdum and Travis Brown. I'm going to try and spot Mark Radulich in the crowd while I'm watching this. So, Mark, bring a sign. And we'll also be previewing the upcoming UFC 170. What are we on, 3 or 4? No, 2. 172, or is it 1? I don't know. John Jones.
No, I think it's 172, I believe.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right. 172. John Jones, Glover Teixeira. John Jones gets a relatively easy win, all things considered. And we'll move on to...
Spoil it. Now they won't listen Sunday.
There's plenty of other fights. There's plenty of other more interesting fights. We all know we're building back to the rematch between Jones and Gustafsson, and Glover's just kind of a get-well fight.
I don't think John Jones knows that.
Probably not, and Jeff is going to yell at us, so tune into the show. A few changes to my weekly column, everybody. Locked in the Guillotine, which was a kind of all-encompassing news report that went live every Friday in the MMA zone of 411mania.com. There's going to be some formatting changes to my column. I'm going to cover less material, but what I do cover will be more in-depth. There's also a decent chance I'll be popping up more than once a week, depending on how things go and how I like the writing style that I'll be using. So look for that. The last one under that format is right now live at 411 Mania in the MMA section, and I'll have plenty of other stuff forthcoming. I'm not leaving. I'm just changing formats, folks. All right, and I can go ahead and announce next week here on Everyone Loves a Bad Guy, continuing my look through comic book villains. Since I tackled The Flash this week, I'm going to be tackling everyone's favorite drunken billionaire, Iron Man, next week. So please feel free to tune back in for that, and there will be at least some discussion of Tony Stark's alcoholism and how he is, in fact, his greatest enemy, and we'll get existential, and we'll discuss addiction. It'll all be very serious, and there won't be any fun.
Will we mention Shane Black as director of Iron Man 3?
Possibly. There's always that possibility. And so come back for that next week, folks. I'll see you then. I believe that's everything. Oh, no. This Tuesday, in fact, The Long Road to Ruin. I am back. I'm temporarily hosting that show while Mark is being a father. Good for Mark. Sean Comer and I will be wrapping up our look at the Saw franchise, and we had good things to say about the first three. The succeeding, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are making me want to vomit, and not in the way a horror film is supposed to make you want to vomit, folks.
There's Julie Benz. There's always Julie Benz hope.
Well, you find the little things.
You hear that, Comer?
Don't poke him. You have to find the little things that make these horrible movies okay. I have yet to find something in 6 that makes me okay with it. I am 15 minutes into rewatching it, folks. We've already had a bit of preach on the following subjects: predatory lending, the American healthcare system, and sensationalistic journalism. I'm not going to rant here, because this is not the forum for that. Tuesday, Sean and I will rant on these movies and how they absolutely gutted, destroyed, defecated, and urinated all over a great legacy.
And I had no idea that Alex Jones wrote Saw 6.
It doesn't help. Nah, that's the one that gets most of the ire, and I feel deservedly so. But all right, so for Pat Mullin, I'm Robert Winfree, and I'm reminding you that without good bad guys, your heroes are just funky guys in tights and capes.
So say good night to the bad guys.